The village market buzzed with life every morning. Vendors shouted over one another to advertise their goods. Fruits, vegetables, grains, and spices filled the air with a blend of colors and aromas. In the center of it all, there was Musa, the butcher in his late 50s, who sold meat at prices so low that he constantly attracted a crowd. Clad in tattered clothes and with a thick beard that seemed to hide more secrets than wrinkles, Musa's appearance was in stark contrast to his thriving business. His stall, modest and worn like him, stood out for its never-ending supply of fresh meat. But before we dive deeper into this tale, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss the next exciting chapter. Amina, a woman in her 30s known for her sharp eyes and even sharper instincts, couldn't help but notice something odd about Musa. She had been selling fruits a few stalls away for years and had watched with curiosity as customers flocked to him. No one knew where Musa got his meat from, especially since other butchers often struggled with supply. Moreover, while others raised their prices during lean seasons, Musa's remained suspiciously low. There was something unsettling about it. Despite his apparent success, Musa lived in a rundown shack on the outskirts of the village, his clothes fraying at the seams, his appearance unkempt. "What do you think of Musa?" Amina asked her friend Fatima one morning, her eyes fixed on the butcher as he served yet another eager customer. Fatima, a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor but a curious mind, had also noticed Musa's peculiarities. "He's strange, that's for sure," Fatima replied, her gaze following Amina's. "How does he manage to sell his meat so cheaply? It doesn't add up." Amina nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. She had grown up in the village and had seen enough to know when something wasn't right. "I think we need to find out more," she said, her voice firm with resolve. The thought of what she might discover sent a chill down her spine, but her curiosity outweighed her fear. That night, Amina decided to follow Musa. She waited in the shadows as he closed his stall and made his way home. She kept a safe distance, her heart pounding in her chest, the night air heavy with suspense. Musa walked with a cautious, deliberate pace, glancing over his shoulder as if sensing he was being watched. When he reached his shack, Amina hid behind a nearby tree, barely daring to breathe. From her hiding spot, she saw Musa enter his dimly lit house and disappear into the darkness. Moments later, she noticed a faint light flicker from within. She inched closer, her curiosity pulling her forward. Through a cracked window, Amina saw Musa handling a large clay pot placed on a low wooden table. The pot looked ancient and weathered, almost out of place amidst the disorder of his small, grimy living space. She strained to see more, her breath fogging up the glass as she tried to make sense of the scene. Musa moved with a strange precision, lifting the lid of the pot to reveal its contents. A sickly metallic smell hit Amina's nostrils even from where she stood outside. She watched in silent horror as Musa began to pull out chunks of what seemed like meat from the pot. But there was something odd, something off about it. She couldn't quite place it, but the meat didn't look like anything she had seen before. It wasn't the usual reddish hue of beef or the pinkish tone of goat. It was something darker, almost purplish and covered in an unsettling sheen. Fear gripped her, and she stumbled back, her foot snapping a twig beneath her. She froze, her heart racing as Musa's head whipped around toward the window. She held her breath, waiting, praying he hadn't seen her. After a tense moment, he returned to his task, seemingly unconcerned. Amina knew she had seen enough for one night. She turned and hurried back to her own home, her mind reeling with questions and terrifying possibilities. When she reached her door, she paused, feeling a wave of nausea wash over her. What on earth had she just witnessed? The next morning, Amina met Fatima at her stall. She pulled her friend aside, her face pale and eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "Fatima, you need to hear this," she whispered, recounting every detail of what she had seen. Fatima listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each word. "What do you think it was?" Fatima asked when Amina finished, her voice barely a breath. "I don't know," Amina replied, shaking her head. "But it didn't look right. I think it could be something terrible." Fatima's eyes widened with realization. "We need to do something. We need to find out what's really going on." Amina nodded. "Tonight, we start watching him together. If there's more to this, we need to know. For everyone's sake." As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Amina and Fatima prepared for their first night of surveillance. The village bustled with its usual noises, unaware of the darkness that might be lurking just around the corner. That evening, Amina and Fatima positioned themselves strategically, hidden among the bushes near Musa's shack. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant sounds of nocturnal creatures. They watched as Musa returned from the market, carrying a large sack slung over his shoulder, his silhouette barely visible in the dim moonlight. The two women crouched lower, holding their breath as Musa entered his home. Through the cracked window, they could see the faint glow of a lantern flickering inside. Musa placed the sack on the table next to the clay pot and, with a grim expression, began to untie it. He reached inside, pulling out a large chunk of that same dark, glossy meat Amina had seen the night before. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she watched him chop the meat methodically, his knife glinting in the low light. Fatima's hand tightened on Amina's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to get closer," she whispered. Amina nodded, and the two carefully crept around the side of the house to get a better view. As they peered through a gap in the wooden slats, they could see Musa mumbling something to himself, his hands working rhythmically as he prepared the meat. Then suddenly he stopped. His head snapped up and his eyes darted to the window. Amina and Fatima ducked down quickly, their hearts pounding. They waited, tense and silent, but after a few moments they heard Musa resume his grim task. Amina swallowed hard, her mind racing with questions. What was this strange ritual? Why was the meat so different? The more she watched, the more convinced she became that something horrific was unfolding. The night seemed to drag on forever, but they knew they needed to keep watching. They were determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, no matter how terrifying it became. The following day, Amina and Fatima gathered at Amina's house to discuss their next steps. They were shaken but resolute. They knew they couldn't go to the authorities without more concrete evidence. If Musa had truly been doing something sinister, they needed proof, something undeniable. "We need to follow him again tonight," Amina said firmly. "We need to see where he gets that meat from. Maybe there's a hidden slaughterhouse or maybe something worse." Fatima nodded, though her face was pale. "I agree. But we need to be careful, Amina. If he catches us, who knows what he might do." That night, they took up their positions again. This time, they followed Musa, not just to his home, but further, as he ventured out into the forest with another large sack slung over his back. He moved quickly and quietly, and they had to struggle to keep up without making noise. The path twisted and turned through dense trees, the moonlight barely penetrating the thick canopy overhead. After what felt like an eternity of creeping through the underbrush, they reached a small clearing. Musa stopped and began digging a hole. Amina and Fatima watched in horror as he opened the sack and began to dump its contents into the hole. More of that strange, purplish meat. A foul smell wafted toward them, and Fatima covered her mouth to keep from gagging. Amina raised her phone, trembling slightly, and took a series of quick photos. The flash was off, but she worried that any sound would give them away. They waited, tense and barely breathing, until Musa finished his task and covered the hole with dirt. Then he turned back the way he came, and they hurriedly retreated, staying just out of his sight as they made their way back to the village. Back in Amina's house, they examined the photos. Though grainy and dark, they clearly showed Musa burying the meat in the forest. "This has to be enough," Amina said, her voice shaky but determined. "We have to go to the police now. If we wait any longer, who knows how many more could be in danger?" Fatima nodded, her resolve firming. "You're right. Tomorrow we show these to the authorities." The next morning, Amina and Fatima took their evidence to the local police station. They were nervous but resolute, presenting the photos and recounting everything they had seen. At first, the officers were skeptical. Musa was well known and relatively liked in the community. But as Amina and Fatima spoke, their fear and determination were palpable. One of the officers, a stern-faced man named Inspector Tunde, seemed to take them seriously. He studied the photos closely, his frown deepening with each passing moment. "All right," he finally said, looking up at them. "We'll investigate this. But if it turns out to be nothing, you both know you could be in serious trouble for making false accusations." Amina nodded. "We understand. But please, just check. Something isn't right." Later that evening, the police organized a small team and planned a raid on Musa's home. Amina and Fatima stayed close, hiding in the shadows as the officers approached the dilapidated shack. The tension was unbearable. They watched with bated breath as the officers knocked on the door, and when Musa answered, the chaos began. The officers pushed past him and Musa shouted in surprise and outrage, demanding to know what they were doing. But his protests fell on deaf ears. They began to search the house thoroughly, overturning every piece of furniture, inspecting every corner. And then one of the officers called out, "Over here, there's something in this pot." Amina and Fatima exchanged a look, their stomachs twisting with fear and anticipation. They crept closer to the house, peering through the same cracked window they had used before. Inside, they saw an officer pry the lid off the clay pot. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by horrified silence. The contents of the pot were unmistakable. Human remains, partially decomposed and floating in a thick, dark liquid. The stench was unbearable even from outside. Musa's face turned pale as he realized the game was up. In a desperate move, he bolted for the door, but the officers were quicker. They tackled him to the ground, restraining him as he thrashed and screamed. Amina and Fatima felt a wave of nausea and fear wash over them, but also a strange sense of vindication. They had been right. The nightmare was real, and they had brought it to light. But now, they faced a new challenge, dealing with the terrifying reality of what had been happening right under their noses. Musa was dragged away, still shouting incoherently about needing money for his children, about doing what he had to do. His words were frantic, filled with a mix of guilt and justification. Amina turned to Fatima, who was trembling beside her. "We did it," she whispered, though her voice was hollow. "We found the truth." Fatima nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. But at what cost? The next day, the village was buzzing with the news. Musa had been taken into custody, and the details of his horrific deeds were starting to surface. People whispered in shock and horror, unable to believe that someone they had known and trusted could commit such monstrous acts. In the police station, Musa sat hunched over in a cold, dimly lit interrogation room. Inspector Tunde and his team pressed him for answers. "Why, Musa? Why would you do this?" Tunde's voice was firm, but there was a hint of disbelief. Musa was silent for a long time, his face drawn and haunted. Finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I needed the money. My children, they're hungry. I had no choice." Tunde shook his head, incredulous. "There's always a choice, Musa. But you chose evil." Musa broke down, his body shaking with sobs. His confession was long, disjointed, but clear enough. He had been killing travelers and vagabonds who passed near the village, chopping up their bodies and selling the meat as regular cuts. The villagers who had unknowingly bought from him were now filled with a mix of outrage, horror, and shame. As Musa's confession spread through the village, a sense of betrayal settled over the community. They had been eating the flesh of human beings, deceived by a man they thought they knew. The air grew thick with tension and grief as people grappled with the grotesque reality. Amina and Fatima were hailed as heroes for their bravery. Had they not followed their instincts and gathered evidence, who knows how much longer Musa could have continued his grisly trade? But even in their newfound status, they struggled with their own emotions. The cost of the truth had been high, and the trauma would not fade easily. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the village began to heal. The market reopened, though Musa's absence left a scar on the daily rhythm of life. The villagers were more cautious now, more watchful. They had learned a hard lesson. Evil can hide in plain sight. Musa was sentenced to life imprisonment, a decision that brought a sense of relief to the village, but also left a lingering shadow. The market, once filled with vibrant colors and friendly faces, now bore a weight of collective trauma. People moved with caution, their eyes darting from one stall to another, their minds unable to shake off the horror of what had transpired. Amina and Fatima, though hailed as heroes, found themselves grappling with the aftermath of their discovery. The reality of what they had uncovered was a heavy burden to carry. They had exposed the truth, but it came with a cost, an innocence lost, a community forever changed. Amina took time to reflect on everything that had happened. She spent her days at the market with a renewed sense of purpose, vigilant and protective of her fellow villagers. Her friendship with Fatima grew even stronger through their shared ordeal. They often spoke of their fears and nightmares, supporting each other as they navigated the emotional landscape left behind. Fatima, too, found solace in the strength of their bond. She realized that their courage had not only saved lives but also set an example for others. The village elders praised their actions, And in a way, the two women became symbols of resilience, a reminder that standing up against wrongdoings was not just an act of bravery, but also a necessary duty. As months passed, life in the village began to slowly return to a semblance of normalcy. The market regained some of its lost vibrancy, though the memory of Musa's deeds still lingered. People became more aware of their surroundings, more careful about whom they trusted. The sense of community deepened, forged by the shared experience of facing a hidden danger together. Amina and Fatima continued their routines, but with a heightened awareness. They knew their actions had set a precedent, and they were ready to face any future threats to their home. They had learned to trust their instincts, to ask questions when something didn't feel right, and to take action when it mattered most. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with shades of orange and purple, Amina looked over the market and felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The village was healing, slowly but surely, and in that there was hope. She glanced at Fatima, who nodded back at her, a silent acknowledgement of their journey and the bond that had been forged through fire. The story of Musa became a tale often told to new generations, a lesson about vigilance, courage, and the power of community. And as the village moved forward, the shadows of the past became a part of their strength, a reminder that light could indeed emerge from even the darkest of places. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss the next exciting chapter.